All right, we're going to call this meeting to order. This is the April 9th, 2015 meeting of the AMATS Technical Advisory Committee. It is 2:32 p.m. First up, Ms. Martin.
Hello.
Ms. Witt. Here. Ms. Hoff. Present. Mr. Lindgren.
Also present.
Mr. Wilbur. Here. I'm here. Ms. Morris.
Present.
We have quorum. Craig, would you mind doing public involvement?
First, we note that Jerry Hansen is excused. He actually did say he would be here. But two are absent. No, three absent. All AMATS meetings are public meetings, and the public is invited to comment. If we have a business item, we'll have a presentation by staff or a consultant, and then the committee will be given a chance to discuss it, and then at that point, the public will be given an opportunity to offer testimony. If you are offering testimony, please make sure to state your name for the record.
I'll try to remind you. All right, next up is the approval of the agenda. Who's approved?
Second.
Moved by Ms. Howe, seconded by Mr. Lindeman.
Thank you, Chair. Just for informational purposes, the agenda that was posted is a little different than this, and I'll go into more detail later, but basically what we had on the original agenda was a major amendment and this administrative modification. After some extensive discussion about what goes into administrative modification versus a major amendment, we realized that what we had originally planned for the major amendment were items that should actually be an administrative modification. And so we removed the major amendment, and so we took those items that were in the major amendment and rolled them into the admin mod, and I'll discuss those when we get down there. In addition, if I could do the administrative modification before the obligation report, and that would make the obligation report make a little more sense. So if we could do the tech memo first, and then the admin mod, and then the op report, I would like that.
So moved.
Any opposed to the change to the agenda? And approving with such changes? Hearing none, we are so moved. So items 5 and C goes. All right, next up is the approval of minutes, and we have a number of them in front of us.
Move to approve December 8th.
Second.
You said move to approve the December 8th ones, okay, the special meeting.
Madam Chair, we have two special meetings here, the December 8th and December 17th. Both of these included members of the policy committee. The December 8th one's the one that you just moved, were chaired by Mr. Campbell. We don't do this very often where we have these joint meetings. So in this case, it seemed to make the most sense to staff that since a lot of the TAC was there, we would take it to the TAC first, approve these here or make changes here, and then take these also to the policy committee at their meeting. So since there were members there, we could approve them at that meeting as well. If that makes sense.
Yes. Do you have any questions? No. All right, so that was moved by Ms. Hall, seconded by Mr. Lindeman. Are there any changes to December 8th? Any opposed to approving? Hearing none. December 8th ones are approved.
Move to approve the minutes of December 17th.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Hall, seconded by Mr. Morris. Are there any opposed? Hearing none, we are so moved. Last but not least, February 12th.
So move to approve the minutes of February.
Second.
This has been moved by Ms. Hall, seconded by Mr. Morris. Are there any opposed? Approval of those minutes? All right. Hearing none, we are so
Thank you, lawyers, for a lot of effort. For a lot of
Good job.
very technical.
All right, next up are the business items. So first item up is 5A, the CMP Tech Memo number 4.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Teresa Brewer. I'm the Senior Transportation Planner at AMATS. AMATS. Before you today, you have tech memo number 4 and a memo outlining what is within the tech memorandum number 4, which is basically a data management plan. We have some edits based on the work session today that we had, and I'll have Dan Kretschmer with the Cambridge Systematics briefly go over it. But it's pretty much a framework for you to know what the available data resources are, and how we can apply them to core performance measures. And so it helps us with the process of data and data management and how we're going to utilize it. I'd like to thank our team members that are here today. They've been Underwood, who's a co-project manager, Andrew Youngblood, and of course, everyone else who's put effort into this. Sharon Walsh did provide some comments, and I'm only bringing this up. I know that we're working on revising, but for the public that's here today, we have a draft congestion management plan network, and there's some revisions and refinements that will occur to that network, and based on some classification types and just ensuring that we have the right facilities that will address congestion management. So I will let you.
Teresa, before I move on, I'll have some comments. I haven't gotten them to you yet, but I will have some comments on the network.
Okay, great, yes, and so we may plan to have a work session just to further refine those corrections and clarifications on that. Thank you.
I have 2 members of the consultant team with me, Carlos Slate Barker, Solstice, and Wes Jacobson of PB, who helped with us. So just a brief description of what's in here. I think, I'm sorry?
State your name for the record.
I apologize. Dan Kretschmer from Cambridge Systematics.
Thank you.
Consultant on the CMP update. So I think, as you recall, we came with a set of goals and objectives that the committee agreed to, and then 2 months ago we're back with a set of proposed performance measures. Those were defined and sort of sorted into 2 piles. One that we felt that could be done in the short term, second group that probably would require more data and more effort, and would be good to implement, but probably can't be done right away as part of the current CMP update. So the next step was to go ahead and say, okay, what does it take to develop the performance measures? What data is out there that we know about that might be helpful? And importantly, what new sources of data may be coming along that could help? What new sources of data, new technologies are coming along that may help either populate some performance measures that we can't populate today, or improve the quality of those that are already under consideration. So essentially, this memo documents the decision of the committee in terms of adopted performance measures. The heart of it is really a table in section 3 that documents the performance measures, the data that are needed to support it, what we know about some of the sources, and kind of a brief evaluation in each case of the pros and cons of each of the potential sources. So I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a framework, it's a guideline. As we get into it and look at some of the data the first time around, there are going to be changes. There are going to be probably things that may be deferred into the future when we find out there's not quite enough information to do what we need to do, or it's difficult to get. There may be some changes in the sources of data that we want to use once we look at it. But for now, this is sort of the framework that builds upon the previous decisions. We then again documented some of the sources of data that are up and coming. There's a model update. We know the HPMS, which really hasn't been used for this highway performance monitoring system, which hasn't been used for this type of analysis in the past, could be. And we also discussed some of the new sources of data that are coming from private vendors, particularly travel time data that's out there and kind of getting better all the time. So those are discussed in here, mainly for informational purposes. And then the final piece is what we call data framework. And this was a concept, again, framework is a term used. There's been a lot of discussion about if you're going to start doing this ongoing monitoring and performance measure development, it would be nice to have, in an ideal world, have all the data in one place and make it easy to get to. That's probably not a realistic goal in the short term, but we've talked about a portal, possibly a front end that would make it a little bit easier to get to different data sources and kind of enhance the ability of people to update that information and get to it. So that's essentially the gist of what's in the data management plan. The next steps we're looking at are to actually identify through the CMP update is the next task where we'd actually try to apply some of these performance measures to the system here and look at where some of the deficiencies are. We have a toolbox or strategy task where we'll be looking at different actions that could be taken for congestion mitigation. And then then there's an implementation plan that kind of goes on the end of this, once we're through that process, and then the status of the system report is the last task. So that's where we are in terms of the context of the project. That's it from my side. Any questions or comments from the committee? Thank you.
Just had a question. Maybe it's just not explicit in here, but one of the things I thought was important is that we capture transit service hours. Is that included in here? I mean, it says transit ridership by type of service, but I think that's an important element. If ridership goes up or down, and obviously depending on service.
Yeah, I thought we changed that to transit ridership per revenue hour, which was.
Okay, I didn't see it at the table.
Okay, if it should be there. If it's
Okay.
not, we'll get that. We'll get that corrected. That was an outcome.
Any other questions? It may seem kind of quiet from committee, but we just had about an hour-long work session on this right before we came to this meeting, so we had a lot of discussion. But at this time, I'm opening it to the public. Are there any questions or comments on the CMP Tech Memo number 4 from the public? I know. A lot to digest. All right, so we've got the matter flagged for committee.
Move to approve the draft Tech Memo number 4.
Moved by Ms. Haas, second by Mr. Bowler. Are there any opposed to the motion? We are approved. Thank you very much. All right, next up is actually item 5C, which thank you for putting it in that order. So, the 2015-18 administrative modification number 3.
Okay, so again, there were originally was posted a major amendment and administrative modification. In the major amendment, if you look at the memo I have here, it says 5C on it, the first two items there were in the major amendment. So the table number 1 was modified to reflect the changes in table 3. And so in table 3, you will see the dollar figures on O'Malley Road, Abbott Road Rehab, and the payment replacement program. That's where the changes are. And the changes are O'Malley Road, instead of going first as it were, let's see, so you had 15 and 16 money in there, and now we have the 14-7 and 17 instead of the 14-7 and Abbott Road Rehab. So we're kind of swapping when they're going, and then instead of the funding line that you see there for the payment replacement program, we have more funding going into it in 2015. The reason we suggested, and it makes sense to us, that this is a minor amendment instead of a major amendment, or administrative modification instead of a major amendment, is the fact that when the policy committee approves the TIP, it approves all the projects and the funding in it. And basically, the schedule of that is up to the however the design goes and the right-of-way acquisition goes, and whether they can do the construction first, et cetera. So because the operating agreement specifically says that an administrative modification has to do with minor changes to project phasing costs, phasing, and phase initiation dates, it seems to us, that the staff, that this would be, these are changes in the dates of when they're going, but not the dollar figures of how much the project, you're not adding a whole bunch of money to a project, and that's when you would do a major amendment. In addition, if you're adding a project that requires a conformity analysis, that is definitely a major amendment. Clearly, we're not doing that. The projects are already in there. And so these boil down to administrative modifications. Administrative modifications don't require public review, and they are approved by the Technical Advisory Committee, and then the DOT Policy Committee and Federal Highways are notified of that. So if you look at the rest of the changes, you can see that after that table 3, there's the line that says remove the AC from FY 16 to 15 for the Rapid Creek construction project. Again, administrative modification, that's a minor change. We updated the project numbers for the bike and ped plans, just not the dollar figures, but just reflecting that there is a contract underway now, and so we can show that. If you turn the page over, you'll see that it also in Table 4 reflecting the need for design and construction funding for the Diamond Center pedestrian and transit improvement project. And then finally, I'm sorry, not finally, but in Table 5, updating the STIP ID numbers for the rideshare and the air quality public and business education campaigns. Again, not changing dollar figures, just reflecting the new numbers there. And then reflecting the money that is being transferred to FTA from the STP funding that we have, our allocation in between those projects. And then updating, removing four projects out of Table 10, the payment replacement project.
I've made the 4 projects being shifted to the pavement replacement project. It's, we're going to do the work with the state deferred maintenance grant. So there's still, the work's going to be done.
Yeah, so we're just taking it out of the federal program.
It's just not AMATS.
Projects will still be done, just not through federal. So, other than that, happy to answer questions between Aaron and I.
In Table 3, O'Malley Road reconstruction, the number for 2016 is different between the memo and the actual table. The memo says it has 3815, and the table has 6788.
Yeah, it's supposed to be, what's in?
The memo?
What's in the tip. It should be the 6788. It was just an error on my part, switching it around.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that it was right in the right place.
Okay, so O'Malley,
Yeah, that's,
so O'Malley in the memo should reflect in FY 17. It does, 40.7.
Oh, 16.
So it should, so in 16, it should be 6788. Okay.
So we'll verify which number it should, before we make the correction and push it forward.
And if you will, also check the text, because
Yes.
it looks like the combined numbers may include the GEO bond, which, if that's the case, then the GEO bond would need to be reflected as a funding source for that year in the table, otherwise it's going to mess up the balancing tip.
We didn't record the PM, so we have the GEO funding right there. So
Yeah, because the tip table should only show that it's federal.
Yeah. Okay.
And if I may, Abbott Road rehabilitation, we're proposing to construct Abbott Road in phases simply because of the ability to deliver right-of-way constraints, right-of-way acquisition constraints. So there is another phase of Abbott Road that's not showing here, and I suppose that would be 2020 or after 2020, depending on when the money's available. And that should show as well. So to be clear, we're looking to be able to deliver, apart from Lake Otis, to a little bit east of Elmore, I think Jupiter, somewhere around there. And then shift to O'Malley, assuming we can get that right away in hand. Do that, and then probably go back and finish up the part from Jupiter up to Birch on Abbott. Thank you. If I haven't confused you, then give me another minute.
So, and just a question.
Yes.
So it's because that right away O'Malley was caused the shift from
Yes.
O'Malley needing to shift the money out, correct?
Correct.
Okay, just clarifying.
Right-of-way acquisition is our primary challenge to capital project delivery at this point.
Okay. So Abbott Road will remain on the list, because like you said, it's kind of 2 phases now. So this will fund that first phase, but then there will have to be additional funding in the future for
Yes.
phase 2. Okay. Any other questions or comments from the committee?
I guess I think it would probably be a good idea to add, this is phase in the project description, phase 2 in the illustrative year, so it stays within the grandfathering table, and so it doesn't look like we're adding a new project in. So that later on in future years, when we added the money for that, the project's already there as a grandfather.
So it would say like phase 2 is illustrative beyond FY19.
Yeah.
Or 18.
Yes, that's what I would.
In the table. Any other questions or comments from the committee? Are there any questions or comments on the 2015 to 18 TIP administrative modification number 3 from the public at this time? Hearing none, now realize to continue.
Recommend approval of the major modification number 3, which is discussed today.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Howe, seconded by Linda Wilbur.
So if I made to be clear on those changes, or do we have to amend the amendment?
With all things discussed for the-
So just to summarize, it would be to confirm the language in O'Malley,
the numbers.
the numbers in the text as well as in the years.
Right.
Yes.
And to add to Abbott Road Rehab, another sentence to say that phase 2 from Jupiter to Birch is illustrative beyond FY18, and to show that dollar amount in the body. And 2020. Is that it?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any opposed to the motion? Hearing none, that is approved.
Greg, that's good, Aaron.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, so next up is the first quarter obligation report.
Okay, so you'll see a few changes here, and hopefully that will help for the future, understanding this obligation for a little better. You can see where the highlighted, yellow highlighted 3 projects there, O'Malley Road, Abbott Road, and the payment replacement. Those are the items that we are asking for your approval on. The rest of them are either going as it is, or not necessary any to have any vote on it. And then it's kind of hard to see right now, we're still a work in progress, but you'll see Spinard Road Rehab, Eagle River Road Rehab down a little farther, and then the first 2 Transportation Enhancement Program projects are in bold, sort of. Go ahead, see that? We're going to talk about those ones that are in bold. So for the first 3 items there, the O'Malley Road, Abbott Road, and pavement replacement, those are the ones we just talked about at the under the discussion about the administrative modification. And so you can see that in column A, it shows what is in the admin mod number 1, not admin mod number 3, since we just adopted that. And then you can see in column B is what we've already obligated through the end of the year. And And then column C is items that have been de-obligated. You don't see down till after the Eagle River Road project. D is what we expect to obligate for the rest of the year, and then E is advanced construct, and then the last column there, F, is when we get farther along, we'll be talking about, we'll have dates in there for when we expect them. So you'll see that in future obligation portions, not in this one. So you can see for O'Malley Road, what we just talked about, how there's the 14.3 in the tip, and so far we've obligated 4.255. And in the remarks, it talks about the obligated AC from 15 to 14 for right-of-way work. And the current estimate for obligation of construction has slipped beyond 2015, and so that was talked about. Abbott Road, we didn't have any money in the original tip for this, but now we show that we're expecting a 5.5, which would be the construction, because that was moving a little faster. And pavement replacement, we were originally at 1 million for the year for 15, and have already obligated that 5.5. And as in the remarks over there, talk about how we're doing Post Road, Rabbit Creek Road, and the AC for Eagle River Road from 0, mile 0 to 5.3. Those are the 3 items that we will need action on today. Spinard Road, just want to reflect the fact that this may slip to 2016. There is, if you can, probably those exact parameters and try to remember this. The agreement is for the municipality to fund the environmental document and complete the right-of-way, and then at that point.
Once the environmental document is accepted, then we'll open up the design phase.
Okay.
So that's.
So the municipality will be creating doing the environmental document, and then after that, it'll be
Yes.
open to this. Okay. A little farther down, Eagle River Road rehab, there is an increase. There's 1.16 million has already been obligated. There's an additional 1.8 needed for that project, and those construction overruns. And again, in the obligation report, if the project is in the construction phase, we're automatically going to fund that. So. And then you see a few de-obligations there to the Old Seward Highway and the Old Glen Highway. So 742,000 worth of de-obligations. Down to the transportation enhancement table. I guess we should change this to non-motorized, since that we're reflecting in the field. Just write myself a quick note. So the bicycle plan project implementation. You see, originally had 650,000, and that 650,000 is expected to be obligated this year. We, in looking at what is out there and the possible design hits, etc., we think we could spend up to 2.3 million additional in that. So if we, as we go throughout the year, we'll look at some of those de-obligations, such as that 742,000. If we're not needing that for construction overruns, or aren't able to make it work, we have the possibility of moving some more money into that project. So staff will definitely be paying attention to that. In the pedestrian plan project, there's the 650 was in the tip, and we're expecting to still obligate that. Expecting to need that 500,000 for design work in 15 or 16. There is now a contract underway, and so with the previous obligated money, so that's still looking pretty good there. Okay. That is it. The things that I wanted to point out to you. If you look at the last page, you'll see that we're at 7.59% of what we're supposed to be obligating, and that's within the plus or minus 15% at the end of the first quarter. So that's where we will be. Yes.
Is that everything?
I am finished.
Okay, well, since we already did the modification amendment, then I don't think we need to do anything with the obligation for now. Yeah.
I guess the modification would reflect this, yeah, so.
We're still kind of a lull period as to what exactly we were supposed to be doing with the obligation reports and how we need to do them. So that was kind of our original intent, to get them all approved, just so everyone's aware of what's going on.
In years past, we tended to do more with the obligation report, and we've been doing a lot more administrative modifications lately, so old habits die hard.
Well, let me ask you, we just changed the orders and did all, I mean,
Yeah.
if I may, our
Going back to our PMPs, does it address the obligation reports in terms of, we're supposed to be within X amount of dollars, 15% at first quarter? Is that addressed as part of the,
Remember,
or just in general drives when it is we need to have policy?
if I remember correctly, it's in the operating agreement. I
Oh.
believe
It's also in
obligation.
PMPs under the.
Under the triggers?
Yes, it's under the trigger events as to what, like, each quarter is supposed to be doing. 'Cause each has to have a certain percentage that you have to be within.
Okay, so it doesn't distinguish it, the way that we track that actually is through the ob report.
Yeah, it talks about first quarter within 15%, second within 10, third within 5, fourth has to be balanced.
Okay, if I may, just for a point of clarification, the construction overruns as much as possible, the department tries to find the obligations to balance that. But for those who are not as familiar with the needs of the TIP, that basically your program is your contingency for everything that's coming in your way. So if indeed, for example, the overrun of $2 million or whatever on Eagle River Road were not to be, there were sufficient offsets for it, de-obligations or low bids on other projects, then there is the potential that it would delay a project in the TIP. So the last one out the door would have to be either AC for next year or postponed. But so far, we haven't had to do that. So, but yeah, thanks. So what's the determination?
I don't think you have to prove anything on that right now.
Yeah, but I guess we already approved it with all the changes in the admin mod.
So it's just an informational.
Is there any, there's nothing in this that wasn't addressed in the admin mod, correct?
That is correct.
Well, other than that, we do show some of the deobs, but that's,
Right, but the deobs are always reflected in the obligation, what not in the admin mods.
Yeah.
The measurements, so.
we don't need to do this?
Move to accept it as information.
Yeah.
There you go. Second.
Just a comment, if you don't,
Yeah,
Joe.
Mr. Rose?
So, Greg, based on the other, just make sure that the admin mods that we just approved are reflected in this obligation report. They're not all of them are, just a couple of small ones. They're pretty minor. I mean, I can point out to you under table 4, under Diamond Center, we added the design phase. Instead of construction, it should be design construction. So when you give this to the policy committee, you see what I'm tracking, Aaron? under-
Yeah, I forgot to change that on board.
And then check the project listing on studies and plans, under table 5, make sure you got the right ones. And make sure that the proposed obligations are reflected as our admin mod. If you could do that. I'll give you a markup. I mean, since it's information, there's just a couple minor things that need to be done for consistency.
We're not approving anything.
Yeah, so, sorry, looking at this, I changed that originally to include Midtown, because I know the Midtown's in there, but then I went to an older version and that was done. So, thank you for pointing that out, and I will make the correction.
You're the one that said it out loud, I was just gonna let you go with that.
I have no problem.
You know what he's talking about, right?
I like it when you mess up your sins in front of others. There you go.
I'm okay with that.
Nicely done.
Well, we're not approving anything, but still, there is the opportunity to open to public comment or questions at this time for this obligation report. Hearing none. Everyone can say that. Actually, I thought, are there any other business items? No. Everything else is informational. All right. So first up, item 6A is the Anchorage ITS architecture update.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Vivian Underwood. I'm Senior Transportation Planner with the Municipality of Anchorage and staff at AMATS. And I'd like to thank the rest of our team, the team of 6 members, and Aaron who is here today, and our consultants, Parsons Frankenhoff, Les Dickinson, who's going to give you a presentation momentarily. And Dan Kretschmer is also a sub on this project with Cambridge Systematics. And Carla Slayton Barker is with Solstice Inc. and helping with public involvement. For this item, you have 3 items. One is a copy of Mr. J. Sherman's PowerPoint. Another is a strategic integration, showing the integration of the ITS architecture with the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and the congestion management process update. And then you have a copy of the draft architecture. It doesn't say draft, but it is draft. And today's really important because it's your last opportunity to speak with Mr. Jacobson and ask him any questions you might have, because we'll be coming to you with the draft architecture next month, hopefully for approval, with along with the use and maintenance guide and the implementation plan. So I will ask Mr. Jacobson to go ahead.
Thank you. So what I want to do is provide you with an update to the status of the project. Part of that will include presenting the structure, the revised ITS architecture, and then how to use the architecture as well in terms of using it for planning, for program development, for project development, and then for design. So what we were tasked to do was to produce an updated, easier to use, more user-friendly, if you want to use that term, regional ITS architecture that meets, of course, the federal requirements and is consistent with both the national ITS architecture and Alaska statewide ITS architecture. There are 3 parts overall of the project. One was the architecture update. The second was the coordination with other planning processes. That's where the strategic integration memo that Vivian mentioned came from. And then the exploration of a concept for a regional / maybe combined with the statewide transportation operations center. We had that workshop yesterday, and at the end, I will just going to summarize what the major outcomes of that workshop were. So the architecture itself, just to remind you, the purpose is to make sure that the investments that are made in ITS systems in the Anchorage area can be leveraged. Make sure that as we build pieces of it, there's some guarantee that when you build another piece, it'll be able to connect with the piece that you previously built. So it's really a way to try and deliver efficient ITS and other projects, traffic management projects that fit under that umbrella. It does that a lot by identifying connections between different subsystems, what subsystem needs to communicate with another one, and then as those are built, they can be specified to make sure that they'll be able to communicate when the entire system is in place or when elements that need to exchange information are put into place. So the objectives, I guess I covered most of that already, so I'll just bypass that one. So where we are, we've done the initial stakeholder outreach, which included interviews. We have done the workshop for the concept of operations, developed the architecture overall, the documentation that goes with it. That was a major restructuring of what had been in place before. Simplify it, consolidate it into a single document rather than having 6 or 7 documents out there. And then the second workshop was to focus on use and maintenance. That was why I was here last time, and we've developed that use and maintenance document. Both the architecture document and the use and maintenance document have been out for review. The architecture document a second time. We don't call that final yet because we have some interviews that are part of the statewide ITS architecture update that we're doing that may have some impact on the regional architecture. So we don't really want to finalize it until we get through that process, at least the interview process, which we'll be doing within the next couple of weeks. And then where we are right now is at the Regional Traffic Operations Center, Transportation Operations Center workshop on the concepts that might be for the functionality of, well, I should say the Transportation Operations Center functionality. So I'll be going into this in a little bit more depth, but don't think of it as a brick and mortar building, but as the functions that are often in the Transportation Operations Center and how best to get those that meet the needs here in Anchorage. So the last architecture had at its base user services and market packages. The newest release of the national architecture really downplays user services, and they changed the market package to service packages. As a way to try and get around there, we're providing services, we're not necessarily responding to markets, I think was the primary reason. But there were a whole slew of those. And every time you wanted to look at where your project was or how it related, it was in a single kind of pretty small area. And to see the big picture was kind of difficult. Plus, there was an awful lot of documentation around each one of those market packages, which made it much more difficult to really understand and see the big picture. So what we've done is tailored those service packages from the national architecture and actually combined several of them into, we're calling them service areas that reflect more what someone might think of in terms of kind of a nuclear portion of the ITS program. So an example of that is we have a service area on transit operations. There are about 9 or 10 service packages in transit operations. So there was never an opportunity to really see the totality of transit operations. You'd have to look at 9 different ones and then remember how they connect. An even worse one is, we don't have that here, but there's one called Advanced Traffic Management Systems. It has like 22. Now, some of those are in the arterial management service area. So it's a way to more clearly see and use and understand what's in your ITS program. And I should mention that this tailoring is not like some rogue thing that's out there that we came up with. Tailoring the market package or the service packages is intentional. The national architecture encourages it, and the mechanism that we use to combine service packages into these service areas was actually something that was recommended through the National Architecture website for just this purpose. So we weren't super clever, and we also weren't, kind of doing something under the table when we did this. So again, the structure is based on the national ITS architecture. It's tailored, and we've combined these different service packages. So here's an example. Arterial management has quite a few service packages within it that are all combined so that somebody could look at what sorts of systems are needed to manage arterial traffic flows. And as I mentioned, we combine these multiple architecture documents into one simplified document, so you can go through it. The text portion is probably, I'm probably going to get in trouble, but maybe 50 or 60 pages. The entire document with all the appendices is maybe 150. But that's much, much smaller than just the physical architecture chapter of the original architecture. And the other nice thing is we developed this through a software package called Turbo Architecture, so it will be easy to maintain, easy to update, easy to kind of look at it in different, from different dimensions if you choose to do that in the future. But the big thing is it will be a lot easier to update and maintain. So I'm going to walk through these different service areas. There are 5 of them. And the significance here of the color is that the blue are the kind of the subsystems within this service area, and the yellow are things from other service areas that communicate with those elements within this service area. So the archive data services would be bringing in information from those different elements on the right side, including transit and from maintenance and from various other areas, and then consolidate them in a way that someone could go in and extract that information later. Arterial management has quite a few more, and they're mostly internal into this service area, and it includes things like the traffic signal system itself. It includes signal priority or preemption, and there are centralized aspects to help control those field elements, and then it also passes information on to other service packages, especially the traveler information service area, and the archive data services. So this is a way that you can more simply kind of see at one glance, although it's not very good.
I was going to say, not clearly.
Not this way. In the actual document, it's much more clear, but yeah, the resolution here isn't great. But to see kind of in one graphic, kind of what's included in this service area. Traveler information then includes information from other areas within the architecture, and it provides a central place to get that information and then provide it both to the public and to other agencies. So that top left-hand box, for example, says control the agency information access. That means that there's some information that might be coming in that for a variety of reasons may not be appropriate to be shared out to the public. So there's a secure, the concept is there would be a secure way to exchange that information among agencies. Roadway maintenance and construction then also has a public information element to get information out. It also has ways to collect information that the maintenance and construction folks could use to help them with their task, including information from weather services, for example. We're also, one part of the process, someone suggested that maybe when it's really snowing hard and you really need to get snowplows out there, maybe signal priority for the snowplows wouldn't be a bad idea. So we've included that concept. I should say that the concepts that are here are possibilities. They aren't things that have to be done. So you still need to go through the normal planning and project development cycle to determine what's most appropriate and highest priority to do, and if and when these specific concepts actually would get implemented. Transit operations, of course, has a whole variety of things. One of the most complicated service area we have. That's not unusual. There's just a lot to be done in the transit management field. And it has systems on the transit vehicles themselves that exchange information with the transit management system, the centralized system, and then that information gets out to others as well, including information that goes to emergency management so that the transit vehicles can be used in evacuation if necessary, as well as informing the transit operations about emergencies and disasters and incidents and things like that. So those are the 5 service areas. I kind of went through them kind of at a high level and pretty quickly, but that's kind of the content of the architecture. I think I'm going to just pause for a minute and see if there are any questions, any concerns, anything that you see.
Under archive data management, so that's not a single physical location, right? It is.
None of these have to be a single, any of these boxes can be distributed any way. It's not meant to indicate physical location, but functional characteristics.
So we were talking about a data depository earlier, a data archive for the congestion management process. So this might actually be an ITS project if we do that. Could be.
Could be,
If we
depending
do
on
the higher
how,
level one. The
you may
higher-
not need to call it an ITS project, it kind of depends.
Okay.
But specifically for the data archive, it could be an archive because there's several different archives that are just networked together. So you can still get access to all of them through a single interface, which is the important piece of the data archive.
So Wes, I just have
Yeah.
some
Mhm.
mechanical questions.
Sure.
So as you've done these in other places, and I'm sure we've had some conversations here about network communication, not communications and speaking, but the ability to actually physically transfer the amount of data at a speed in which is actually meaningful, and then actually put it in places with enough storage and enough authority that you can access, and then you don't want others to access. So you've kind of vetted, and it's kind of the implementation of, yeah, that bar needs to talk to this bar, and that bar actually talked to this bar with our current communication network in Anchorage. I imagine in other places it's more limiting in rural places than it is in urban, so you kind of got that identified in the plan?
This doesn't really look at it. There's an inventory of what exists in terms of systems and subsystems and communication. It doesn't do that analysis to say, in order to build this piece, you would need to increase your communication bandwidth, and it would have to have, these security features and things like that. That's not it.
I mean, in the bus business, that is a limitation. It's not that we don't get the data, it's the speed in which we can actually use it, modify it, share it, and do all of that.
A lot of times it's like drinking from a fire hose too, because you can get so much data from ITS systems that it's hard to grasp and visualize how you can use that.
Well, I just think about that in the transit operations, and I think about how a central organization, and maybe you'll talk about that based on the workshop you had yesterday. It's not that we don't have it, it's our ability to share it and who controls the method in which it's shared. I mean, for a municipality, it's a corporate department that manages every other department's technology, and we just get in line when we want to update our desktop from Windows 3 to freaking XP or something, so this is dreamy.
Yeah.
So, there you go.
Yeah, that's not necessarily unusual, by the way.
All right.
Okay. Any other questions on the architecture itself?
You mentioned an architecture program. What platform? Would that be something that?
It's really just a database program.
Okay.
And it runs on Windows.
Okay.
And it's free to download from the National ITS Architecture website.
Okay.
Now, the file, the database file,
Yeah.
doesn't get downloaded from that, but it'll be available through, initially probably through Vivian, but eventually will be, might even be on the website for people to download. So the use and maintenance report, or guide, we call it, actually is broken up into how to use the architecture and then how to maintain the architecture. Using the architecture is generally for 4 purposes: for planning, for program development, project development, and design, as I mentioned earlier. What we did is we mapped some of the projects, types of projects, to the service area in the strategic integration memo. And this is really around primarily planning sort of level of use, so that you can look at, if you're thinking of a potential project and you need to see if it's in if it's in the architecture, so that you know if it's not, that before it's implemented, you'll have to update the architecture to be in conformance. It doesn't mean that in order to put a project that's not in the architecture in your plan, that you would first have to update the architecture. The requirement, the federal requirement, is that before it's implemented, it needs to be in the architecture. So from the planning perspective, what's important is that you identify those projects that might be going into your plan and eventually into your program, and then eventually to be implemented, that you identify that it's not in the architecture yet, and so the architecture has to be updated. That's one of the major purposes here, and you'll see that throughout. So I essentially mentioned this already. We want to identify those activities and elements and see that they're in the architecture so that you know if they are or not. The other important aspect is that you can also identify the stakeholders, because in the architecture it has stakeholders identified for each of these ITS elements. And you can see the stakeholders who you might want to have involved in the planning process if they're not already involved. And it also, again, provides feedback to the architecture if new ITS elements are needed and are not represented. There's this table in the strategic integration memo, as well as in the use and maintenance guide, that links the planning step to the ITS architecture and shows at each step where the architecture would fit in. So with goals and objectives, it would be important to identify those key architecture stakeholders associated with those goal areas, so you can keep them involved in the planning as it moves forward. If you look at development of alternatives, again, look at the architecture to determine whether the solutions are included. And if they're not, it doesn't mean you can't include them. It's just to make sure that you keep track of that so that you can update the architecture if need be. Same sort of thing with the refinement of potential ITS solutions. You'll want to see if those things are in the architecture and if you need to refine the architecture in any way. And then, again, as you select your projects, that's when it's most important to say, if I've included them in my plan, then, and if they're not in the architecture, we want to note that so that the next update, the architecture can be updated. We also include these charts to show some coordination. Now, we didn't develop these. These are actually from FHWA in their planning for operations types of projects. One thing that I would point out is, pardon me, it doesn't work, okay. If you look at the third green box down, it says systematic process to develop and select M&O strategies to meet objectives. That's essentially what you might think of as an ITS or operations strategic plan. That's one thing that there's probably a gap. If you think about your planning process, you have a PED plan that goes into your planning process. One of the things that I would suggest you take a look at is if you should have something similar to that to your ITS plan. The architecture isn't meant to select projects or to prioritize projects. It's meant to say, here are your projects, or here are your system elements. And if you choose to do one of these, make sure that if there's a dependency, that you do it in the right order. So that's what the function of the architecture is. And your strategic plan may or may not be updated more frequently or less frequently than your architecture, but they don't need to be tied together in terms of doing them all at the same time. So that's one thing that will be included. I just wanted to point that out as long as we were looking at these charts. Each one of these charts has that same systematic process bubble and kind of the same sorts of things that you would do in any sort of strategic plan. And this is the coordination with the congestion management process that's also in this. Architecture can also be used for program development. So once you've got it in your plan and you're looking at putting it into your TIP, for example, you again want to look at those projects that you prioritize and make sure that they're in the architecture. It may, again, help you identify stakeholders that should be involved as the project is put into place or put into the program. And again, provides feedback. Much similar types of purposes that you see in the planning side. And again, for project development, so it's time to start working on the project and do your preliminary design and whatever. Again, you want to make sure that you look at that architecture to make sure it's in there. But at this point, there's some other important things to look at, and that is what systems may need to interface with that. So as you build your system, you allow for that. And then also, at this point is where you want to start this systems engineering checklist that's a requirement of the federal government as well. And that's essentially just saying, I'm doing all the things that I need to do to make sure that my ITS investment is going to be efficiently made, and you're not going to find yourself in a box where you can't communicate with the system that comes later. And at this point, it's a little bit more important if you see elements of that project that aren't in the architecture. That's probably about the time you want to think about how do we update the architecture, if you haven't done it already. What we will include is, well, this is actually in the use and maintenance document that says, kind of identifies those system engineering elements that are required and whether it's included in the architecture or not, if it can be found in the architecture, and gives an idea of what it is. There are some things that aren't. The analysis of alternative system configurations, that's not part of the architecture. That's what would be part of the system design. Same thing with procurement options. And then once you get into design, there are some additional things that the architecture can do. If you don't have something like a concept of operations for the subsystem that you're building or system that you're building, there are requirements that are included in the architecture that can help you to specify your system. It also identifies some of the standards that are needed when you go into the project specification. And again, if elements of the design of the project aren't in the architecture, then it provides a feedback on updating the architecture. So that's really the use. I'm not going to show you about the maintenance because I doubt anybody in this room is going to be maintaining the architecture, and it would you'd probably wonder why I was wasting your time. Anyway, the next steps on this, we've already completed the use and maintenance draft. We will convert that to the final as we pick up the last few comments that there might be there. We'll also revise the architecture, mostly based on what happens from the interviews, from the statewide interviews, so that we can finalize those two documents. I'm going to skip the next one and come back to it. We'll also develop the implementation plan, again, after the architecture is complete. What that essentially does is say, here are the elements that are left to be built. So don't think of it as a list of projects, but a list of project types that could be done. We will provide the outreach materials. We've got those already, mostly through the graphics that we've already provided and through the presentations that we've done. We should be complete with the project probably by the end of June, if not sooner. Going back to the summary memo on the Transportation Operations Center workshop. It was a really good workshop yesterday. There were, I don't know, about 10 stakeholders in the room, and from state troopers, APD, Anchorage Fire, emergency operations, traffic both on the state side and on the municipality side. I'm sure I'm going to forget some folks. Planning, of course, and Rick Feller, who's Special Projects Manager for DOT and PF. And we talked about what sorts of things, what sorts of functions, or what sorts of things get done in a transportation operations center. Based on needs of the area, we provided some kind of a broad range of how transportation operations systems are done around the country, from very large, kind of centralized buildings that have, maybe as many as 8, 10, or even 12 agencies under one roof, to very, very distributed, essentially totally virtual operations center, where there is perhaps no single thing that you would call a center. So we went through some of those configurations and then had a really good discussion. And the results of that discussion were that the thing that everyone felt was probably the TOC functionality that needed the most work was on sharing information and how best to do that, and not only among agencies within the same jurisdiction, but across jurisdictional boundaries. One of the things that the captain from the troopers said is he's got pretty good situational awareness outside of the municipality. He doesn't have very good situational awareness inside, and things spill over. So it'd be really nice if there was better visibility across those jurisdictional boundaries. So there was also this feeling that there needed to be better information out to the public. so that they were informed of what was going on in traffic conditions. I think we heard that in the work session earlier this afternoon as well. And so the kind of the consensus, overwhelming consensus on the next step would be to focus on those areas. And the group decided that the best way to do that was through forming a working group. Rick Feller volunteered to kind of convene and be the catalyst for that working group. And there were about 4 or 5 people who volunteered to help them out with the initial steps. That included state troopers, emergency operations, traffic on both sides and planning, and the emergency operations guy was pretty sure that fire would be involved in that as well. So a good group, they're going to get together sometime in the next month or so and really talk about what are the next steps so that they can start moving the ball forward to get to that better information sharing. And that could be the first step in, are there other things that are needed? Or is that information sharing at this stage in the state and municipality as far as you need to go? So that's kind of the outcome of that workshop. And that was the last thing that I had to cover. Are there anybody who was at the workshop yesterday anything I missed or you want to point out?
Well, I would like to point out that there was a common ground there. Both people from the state and the muni recognize that neither entity can do this by themselves. It has to be a cooperative effort, and to me that was a huge realization. And the fact that we had all these people in the same room, talking to each other at the same time, to have the troopers and ABD sitting next to each other was wonderful, and so we've been trying to work towards this for like the last 12 years. 12 years we've been trying to work on just improving 511. It's part of our work program, actually, that we will support 511. But the mechanics of that has been just horrendous. So to have the operations people actually talking to each other, rather than have a middleman trying to, go here, go there, trying to get these people working together, I think I'm thrilled. And they were very happy.
Any other questions or comments from anyone? I appreciate your time and your attention.
So, you said the ITS architecture update, this is draft.
This is a draft. It should say draft. Next time we come to you, it'll be a TC draft for your approval.
Now, to everybody.
I beg your pardon?
So we're written in down to everybody.
To everybody in this room.
Okay, I need the public.
No, not this
Okay.
time. You just-
Otherwise, you're gonna need to take them all back and write draft on them.
It's really a final draft. It's not the initial draft. It's been through the comment cycle. It's really just waiting for input from the interviews from the state project.
Okay. And next up, that was 5A, right? Okay, I mean 6A.
Six
So
A,
this
sorry,
is
6A.
6B, sorry, so we're on the House of Travel.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Teresa Brewer, Senior Transportation Planner of AMATS, and Dr. Contra from RSG will be giving the presentation, and of course his team, R&M Consultants, Spring Consultants, and Dow Group assisted with this effort. The Household Travel Survey report was completed late winter, and the purpose of this presentation is to show you results of that survey and the Transit On Board Origin Destination Survey, and then also how it helps us develop our travel demand model update. As you know, Jeff's team is working on the travel demand model update. So with that, Jeff, I will let you take the presentation.
You there?
Thank you, Teresa. I just want to do a couple logistics checks first. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, if there are questions, I would request please that perhaps Teresa could sit close to the microphone because I couldn't hear much of what was said before in some of the questions, and so that would help me to be sure that I answer your questions.
Okay. I'll sit by Craig.
So if we could please go to the third slide that has the agenda on it, please, start there.
Okay.
And one last thing, how much time do you want me to take?
Probably 10 minutes, maybe 10 minutes or less.
Sure. All right, well, thank you all very much. As Teresa mentioned, I'm Jeff Perconja. You've heard me before. I'm the project manager of the Travel Demand Model Update, and I'm giving a presentation to you about the survey results because at this point in time, my team has actually taken the reports and the data from the two survey teams, and we are using that data to update your travel demand model. And so I'm going to both give you an overview of both the household survey and the transit on board survey and talk about the results of them more in the context of what we're going to do with them to update the model. Naturally, the data is quite rich from those sources, and there is a lot to cover for other planning purposes and efforts that you may have in mind. But my point of view is more on the model right now, and so I'm going to convey that to you. But, you know, staff have copies of both reports, and I believe you folks have reviewed them. I know that the transit surveyors got some substantive comments from Lance. Thank you, Lance. So all the details will be at your disposal. And I also want to remark that in the context of both of these data products, this is information about the surveys as they were completed as standalone products. But I encourage you to think of the presentation today as a preview, really, because by the time we validate the model, we will have gone into much greater detail with the data, and you will see tabulations in the model validation report, and then there will be a presentation to you about that. We'll have more detail than you're going to see today. So having said that, I'm going to go to slide 4, please. I'm going to start with the household travel survey. You probably know already the geographic area that was chosen to survey includes both the Anchorage sub-area as well as the Matsu Valley sub-area of the entire Matsu Borough. So taken together, the green and the tan areas on the map on the screen show the geographic coverage of the process for the surveys. And the reason for that, of course, is that even though your formal planning boundary is not as big as the survey area, we know from past experience that there's a lot of travel from Matsu to the Anchorage side of the picnic arm and vice versa. And so we want the survey to cover all that so the model and your other analyses can internalize all of the major travel generation going on that's affecting the Anchorage side. So staff also asked us to be sure that we oversampled during the actual survey certain geographic areas for primarily two reasons. And as you yourself know, there are some rapidly growing sub-areas within both the Matsu Valley and the Chugach Eagle River areas on the south side of the arm. So those areas were oversampled to be sure that the current relatively low population does not preclude getting a decent representation of how those folks travel, since they're expected to grow rapidly and their proportional share of the region's population is going to increase dramatically over the next couple of decades. The other reason to oversample was to be sure that some of the low-income areas were properly represented. So those are shown in pink, both in the enlargement of central Anchorage as well as the northeast part there of the entire area. Now, just to keep things to 10 minutes, I'm not going to go through some of the survey characteristics in great detail, but a couple of key takeaways for you would be that the actual sampling was done last fall, and the survey included both a complete travel diary of all the households and their members that were chosen to represent the region, but also some general behavior and attitude questions, such as how frequently people travel by transit. And so there's a lot of useful information there that I would commend mention. There was a lot of public outreach, and there was a lot of provision for respondents with low English proficiency, in Tagalog, which are key languages in your area for environmental justice purposes. And critical to my perspective as a modeler and forecaster is the fact that the overall sample actually reached 2.2% of all the households in the chosen study area. So that's pretty robust. There are regions that have gotten along with 1% samples, so I'm quite happy to have that, and I thank you all for funding it. Also, as you can see, there was a significant response from the Matsu Valley sub-area, and the table at the bottom, you can read the details up at your leisure, but the key takeaway from that is that the target responses were all obtained, so there were no sort of undersampling problems, which is, again, encouraging. It means we have a robust and trustworthy sample. A few highlights here are the actual findings. I want to caution you, these are unweighted responses, so the percentages you're seeing are straight from the sample. The data has been weighted already, but as I mentioned, we're doing a lot more detailed analysis for the model update, so we'll be coming back to you with tables and charts like this that are from the weighted data once we've gone through all the details and chosen the actual frames that are useful to the model. But there's still some interesting findings here, I think, for discussion. This is the mode share breakdown across the entire sample for all trip purposes. As you can see, the drive alone has a significant share. Taken together, auto-based trips comprise about 86% of the sample, with pedestrian and bicycle trips coming in second at 10% taken all together, and school and transit bus coming in the low percentage range. This may change slightly when we look at the weighted data. This is a heads up. The other way that we're going to be looking at this data very closely as we have to model is the purpose for which people travel. So we want to be sure that we have a good distribution of trip purposes in the sample. And as you can see from the pie chart, that was pretty successful also. Now, these are one-way trips from one origin to one destination. These are not linked trips or tours that may include multiple stops. So naturally, a lot of people wind up going home. There's, of course, a lot of people going to work. The other trips comprise a very fine-grained detail of trip purpose that again may be used for different planning purposes. We're going to be aggregating these much more closely for model purposes, of course. But the takeaway here is that the span of trip purposes seems to be pretty robust as well. The actual mode used to go to work is of key importance as well. The work trip being a specific purpose that the model will treat explicitly. And so it's informative to look at the sample distribution of mode choice to work. Once again, drive alone is the dominant mode, which we expect. And bike taken together come in second at 4%. Individually, you see in the charts that bicycle are walking is about 1.7 to 2%, and there's a van pool presence as well. So again, the sample seems to have covered these in ways that are clearly proportional to what you folks would expect and we would expect, so this is encouraging. And again, there's a lot more detail in the actual data that you can look at. And so what are we going to do next? As I already mentioned, we're going to analyze the weighted data. We are going to compare specific data sets that will let us keep the parameters for different components of the model, such as the step that actually generates the total number of trips in the region, and the step that decides what modes the model of travelers are going to choose. We spent a lot of time looking at things by different purposes, because we know that people travel differently, different parts of the days that they're doing, for example, going to work versus going shopping or going to recreate or go out to dinner. And there's going to be a lot of geographic analysis to be sure that the model is properly representing trip generation in different sub-areas of the region. Table at the bottom simply demonstrates the expanded data set and how much expansion had to be applied to different categories of income. There were many expansion factors used to expand the data. Those are described in the report. The main takeaway from this plot is that the expansion has definitely succeeded pretty well. You can't hit each category exactly because, as I mentioned, it's trying to expand using multiple criteria such as household income, the number of workers in the household, the total number of household members, and several other factors. So that's why you're seeing the differences, the difference called from the actual census-based ACS control rules. But this is pretty typical for a survey of this type. Even with the oversampling in the low-income category, is slightly underrepresented, and we'll be careful to compensate for that as we proceed. So that's a segue to transit. I see I'm running out of time here, so this is going to be rapid. The survey, from a transit perspective, was very carefully designed to look at all the people mover routes. You can see from the chart on the left that once again, the goal of reaching a 10% sample of all of the routes was achieved. And Eagle River Connect, there wasn't really a target because of the way the past data was presented. It did succeed in sampling 4 of the 9 daily trips that service makes. This was done in the fall, roughly the same time frame as the household travel survey, outreach, and so there was provision for low English proficiency respondents. Now, again, looking at some of the actual findings, in this case, since there's sort of overall detail, because in this case, the transit survey is just looking at transit behaviors rather than all the transportation behaviors. We have more progress to date on the weighted results, and these are just a few of the really important characteristics that we're looking at as we update the model. Number of people earned in the household is essentially flat for folks who don't really have alternative to transit, and that's captive riders. And as you can see, on the weekday and the weekend, very much proportion of the users of your system are essentially transit captive folks. You can see an income distribution on the right-hand chart. A finding is consistent with that. About 30% overall of your transit users are making less than $10,000 a year household income, so that is consistent with the vehicle finding. Very important characteristic for the model will be trip purposes, and as you can see, there is a we could capture multiple purposes. A lot of folks are going to work on transit. There's an interesting spike in the weekend usage of transit for shopping, eating, and dining. And then, of course, we very much want to know how people got onto the bus. And the lower right chart shows us that fairly walk access dominates in your region with some bicycle fairly small drop-off. For example, the parking ride activity would be in the other category here. So, the transit model. And similar to the household travel survey, the transit survey gives us trip end locations, which will be very important for validating the model. And we have further work to do to update the model. We're going to more specifically analyze the data set in a lot of dimensions to prepare calibration and validation targets. And as I said, there will be some geographic specificity to that. And so, just speaking as a model practitioner, I'm pleased with the results. The samples are robust. We've covered a lot of ground. There are some weighting things where you have to be careful of, but nothing that is atypical. We'll have to stop and see if there are any questions.
Yes, just this is Jennifer, Jeff. I have a quick question about the information that actually made it into the newspapers and then actually made it into the Associated Press, and that was the finding that there are more people that commute to work by airplane, float plane, and helicopter than by bus. And so I haven't taken the survey. I understand, I recall that there was the ability to indicate whether your travel mode and your activities of that day were typical. Is there a description in the report itself about, has there been an effort to understand that very unusual data? I mean, did it capture days when there were a lot of people that were on their commute to the North Slope, for example? Was there a distinction between recreational travel and work-related travel? Although I think this says that it's work, but is there an explanation in the survey, because it doesn't pass the straight face test? I mean, there's something weird that happened with that data, that there's so many, although I know one of them is the guy next to me who actually never goes anywhere, but he flew to Dillingham that day. And so did, in the mode choice, is there a distinction between what is typical and what is atypical? And is there an effort to explain this anomaly? Because I imagine it's a little unusual for any MPO to have this kind of mode split with air travel.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, there is typical mode to work, and so that actually, if you can go to slide 9, please. So, we do have some information with which we could look at as we dig into this in more depth. We can certainly look at the comparison between the typical mode to work responses, which again are those stated responses that I alluded to earlier, and the actual diary response, which is the observed response. And so we certainly look at that as we proceed. Those are some of the details that we have yet to get to, because we're not quite to that point in the model chain yet.
Right.
But look, in general, I would say this. I think that your staff very much wanted to capture some of the modes that are unique to the Alaska area. And so the inclusion of those details was deliberate, and I think it's also plain from the data that at this point in time, the transit mode share of the region is fairly small compared to huge urban areas with heavily developed transit systems. So when we're looking at these very small percentages, I would hesitate to draw sweeping conclusions from them. So I guess I'm saying two things in response to your question. Yes, we will certainly look into what is typical versus what was actually observed. But second of all, I'm sure the press enjoyed writing about that, but I'm not so sure that it's something, policy choice, and we'll come back to you to see what we think of all the details later. So that's my answer.
Yeah, and just if I could briefly address that, remember when you're looking at airplane and transit's going to have way more frequency than airplane, and so you have to think of the frequency of those trips. So it was one of those add-on questions, and of course the MPO does surface transportation. We're not going to model airplane facilities or those type of things. It's just to figure out how people go to work, but that frequency on the airplane trips is much less than transit. Transit's going to be a lot more frequency.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that this is just talking about typical work. This is just a work trip. If you look at, there was another slide that showed all the other uses for why people are using transit. There's so many other purposes out there, and that shows you there's transit is being used for all sorts of trips for so many other reasons besides just work. That's the thing for me to keep in mind.
The other thing I would say along the lines of what Craig mentioned is that on my last trip to speak to you folks, flew home sitting next to people who worked in the oil business, and one of them as the support person at the base, and another guy as someone who was actually on the rigs. And I think it is fair to observe that your sort of the work in the Alaska area is very different from the Chicago area for a small group of people who are industries. And so that was the attempt to capture some of that, I think, was by design. I think that we just need to understand the meaning of it to help you folks make your policy decision.
Well, just a little observation for future reference. The next time you help an MPO with a survey, it would be good to have this conversation before the AP press gets a hold of it, or a mayor, or somebody like a DOT commissioner, because I had a lot of splaining to do. So it's just hard to believe that 4,000 people go to work every day by plane, when I know at least 4,000 people out of the 13,500, 15,000 people we carry on the bus every day, and only 28% of them are going to work. That's 4,000 people. Maybe 4,000 people are going to the slope every day as an average trip. I could see it on a Tuesdays and a Thursdays, but please don't underestimate from the receiving end of having to explain it then, oh, well, it looks good. Please, Jeff, don't do that again. I encourage you.
Point noted. Thank you.
Yeah.
And also, it's been a while since we've talked about the model and some of the assumptions. There are a lot of questions about some of the data still that I would still expect to see answers to, and I guess I can follow up with Craig and Therese to bring those back up again. But because understanding what this data means and how it's used, especially since you are applying it very, very differently to the Mat-Su Borough than they apply to themselves, this group really needs to understand what those differences are and what it means, especially when you are coupling it with very different assumptions about existing population and jobs as well as forecasted in either location. And so I guess there's going to be future work sessions and other documents to review, but thank you for the presentation. And I would agree with Lance, it was a little disconcerting to have questions from the governor's office through the through the regional director asking, what is the source of this and who authorized this and what does it mean? So I echo that in terms of releasing that kind of data without it having come through this body first.
And I will say the crew that you guys had on board our buses and our transit they did a great job. I had no concerns or complaints. People asked them, what are they doing? Is there a hidden agenda? So they did a great job, working with our passengers to get good certain information. So I do compliment you on that.
Okay, thank you. And I want to come back to, I think it was Jennifer who was just speaking about questions. So it would help us help you if you could have those given to staff and they could compile a list that we could then address directly. I realize that, with me sort of picking up now with model development and the surveyor is essentially done, that there's been a handoff. And so I just want to be sure that I am fully aware of the questions that you need answered so that we can address them explicitly.
Yeah, I think we can answer the questions, but let's just go ahead and let that dog lie. We don't have to drag it out, but it would be good just for future reference and get some answers to these questions for our benefit and yours.
Any other questions?
Jeff, this is Steve Morris. Just a quick question about how this information will be used. For example, if you find that there's different trip-making behavior in the Matsu borough than Anchorage Bowl, will that be a part of the model? Aside from income differentiation, let's say that say there's a difference in the way the travel patterns or something in the Matsu borough with the same socioeconomic data for their census tract, will that be handled differently in the model?
It's a good question. The short answer is yes, as long as we can do so without sort of biasing the model inappropriately. One of the things we frankly are going to be taking a look at, because we do expect different behavior for similar households, is trip length. So it's plausible to expect that folks in a certain income bracket might be making longer trips to work if they live in Matsu than if they live in Anchorage. And so that's one of the things we are going to be taking a specific look at, and we may introduce factors that account for the geographic area of residence to help the model compensate for that.
Similar like carpooling, for example, van pooling propensity, that sort of thing as well?
Right. We can look at van pool formation. I know it's a great concern, and we are examining how we could add van pools in explicit mode to the mode choice element of the model. So that could be another area that would have different behaviors, partly because of the distances involved.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. I hate to cut you off, but we only have 15 minutes left and a couple more topics to get through, so.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff.
You're welcome. Thank you all. I'll be talking to you again. Bye.
Bye. So next up, item 6C, the interim 2035 MVP schedule and update.
It's just like from the staff that did that.
We're done with PowerPoints.
Oh, I got it.
Huh?
I'm sorry.
Oh,
Do you have
sorry.
a visual?
We'll have one more after this.
I do.
You want to go?
No, go ahead, ma'am.
Go
Thank you, Madam Chair.
non-motorized. Surface order.
We have made a lot of progress on interim NTP update in that the state has, we've gone through their procurement process, and they're fixing to sign the contract with PVC Engineering, which we're very thrilled about. That probably won't happen until next week, but we have certainly been working behind the scenes, getting ready to work with them. So we will hit the ground running. Our goal is to have a first draft to you in May, and to ask for your recommendation for the draft to go to policy committee in June. We are now going on 2 weeks behind schedule because of contracting procedures, but we will try to overcome those, and I'm confident that we'll have something that you'll be proud of. It'll be a minimal document, and for the first time in Chapter 8 implementation, we'll be being sort of a report card on ourselves on how well we've done with implementing NTP since
One other item about the MPP update is that I discussed with Mr. Weaver and the current planning manager about whether or not the interim MPP needs to go through Planning and Zoning Commission. Since it's an element of the comp plan, whether they're a citizen advisory committee or not, it would have to go through them, an MTP would. In discussion, we agreed that because this interim one is only updating the financial information, it is not updating the goals and objectives, it is not updating the,
Project list.
adding new projects. Project list is staying the same, we're just showing the ones that we completed, that it is not updating the comp plan, and therefore we don't need to take it to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So, Jerry said that I should also see if we can do that same thing with the assembly. So I did send a similar message off to Mr. Flynn and Mr. Steele. So I haven't heard back from them yet, but so we might be able to do that as well. Either way, the assembly is a much shorter time frame of getting through. The planning and zoning is the long one, but we don't have to take it through there now. So that gives us a little bit of a breather.
Yeah. All right. And last but not least, Elise was on the first agenda.
Yes.
AMATS website update.
Jamie has been working like crazy to update our website, and so if you haven't looked at it recently, she's going to walk us through that to see all the amazing work that has been going on behind the scenes.
And that is really small. I apologize. So, if you have never had the privilege of editing a municipal webpage, I welcome you to my life for the last about 3 weeks. We received a lot of feedback from FTA, FHWA, and the public over a large span of time. I've only been here for almost 9 months now, and since then have heard several comments about what is going on with your guys' website. We recently had our federal planning certification review, and so no major work had been done on it to that point, as they were pulling documents off and looking for things around and didn't want to pull off an overhaul while they were trying to do all of that.
Sorry, Jamie, this looks good. I like it.
Thanks, Cindy. So basically, it went through a real brief process that's mapped out on your handout. I mapped out the existing site. We went from 103 pages down to 63. I looked through all of the images, made sure they were tagged. If they weren't, were they relevant? Did we need them? Did they still need to exist? And then I followed all the links to see where did they dead end at. That was quite a process. I looked at the content. We looked at all of the documents. We looked for duplicates, obsolete documents, things that were from 1981 that had not had a page view in 10 years. There was a lot of information on that, on the old site. We did a quick scan to see broken links. Were there any 404 missing page messages? And then I started looking at URLs. And man, some of them are really ugly. As you may know, AMATS' page is housed under community development. And so that page URL gets really long, really fast. So we're really trying to push the muni.org, yeah, you can see it up top. Yeah, AMATS at least made it on this page. So we have really been pushing the use of muni.org/transplan. That will take you right here to our webpage rather than having to click through. So there was the sitemap, there was the inventory, then there were analytics that were pulled on the sites. I wanted to know where people were going. I wanted to know what documents they were pulling. And I wanted to know, were they even in Anchorage when they were viewing our site? Who's looking at our stuff? And then I wanted,
Did you get that from IT?
I did.
Okay. I'm asking for
first one. So then I wanted to know where people were coming from. How are they finding out about AMATS? You know, I found out that the #1 way that they come to our website is through our agenda newsletters. So they come through there, they come through Google, other search engines, and then social media. So then I did some functionality testing. I wanted to know how fast our page was, and it wasn't at all. I wanted to know what was the readability. We're shooting for a 4th through 6th grade reading level, just based on the demographics of our populations. We were like sophomores in college, so that needed to change. I wanted to see what the browsers looked like. You know, people are using IE, they're using Chrome, they're using Firefox, and before I started this, it looked different on every single browser. Some were prettier than others, but we wanted a consistent look and feel throughout the entire site. And then I wanted to know about shareability. We have no shareability through this platform. So, you know, could people post stuff to social media? How could they get our information out there once they got here? And then keyword searches. You know, where were we popping up in Google? Where were we popping up in other search engines? We weren't really. So that's going to be an ongoing challenge, because tagging and metadata and things like that is going to be a slow process for us, because this platform doesn't have a lot of functionality there. And then navigation, like how do you find what you want on this website? And you could go at it from 50 different ways and end up at a website in Japan. So literally, highway to highway, ended up at a website in Japan. So I was like, wow, that's gotta go. So then the final thing was site accessibility. We have ADA requirements. You know, what happens when somebody that uses a screen reader goes to our website? Can they access anything? So that's important. PDFs, how do PDFs show up on our website? Can somebody using a screen reader even access our PDFs? No. So that's going to be a work in progress. And then we had some goals based off of all of these findings. We wanted it simple, 3 clicks or less. We wanted it streamlined, and we wanted improved navigation. It needed to be clean. When I think about how many times I look at a website on my tablet or on my phone, this now fits without having to scroll through on your phone and on your tablet. I wanted to get rid of obsolete documents and projects that weren't even in existence anymore. They've been completed, so why have them on our website? So then the accessibility features of the ADA requirements, PDFs, and mobile devices, that was another goal. And then functionality. It needed to be faster, it needed to be more responsive, intuitive, and it needed relative information. So the design strategies that were used, you'll see through the entire website, we moved towards a icon-based or image-based, I'm sorry, at 100%, this just takes up so much room. So move towards a more fluid feel, being able to actually click on images that actually told somebody, if they couldn't visually see the page, what they were accessing, cut down the level of the text and the technical side, made it for Joe Public that might not come to these meetings and could get a firsthand kind of introduction to AMATS. So we did that, made it mobile friendly, cleaned up the information, and then made it multi-browser compatible. Now those seem pretty elementary, but when you look at the challenges that we have through SharePoint, our functionality, we're working off of version 1.3 basically. Last thing I heard is community could upgrade to 13 if they would make the investment. So we're a little behind in the sense that we have what we have, I guess you could say. I went through, and as we redesigned, made sure that the document URLs matched what it was actually taking you to. So if you're looking for the MTP, your URL is going to have MTP in the title rather than a ton of 20s and percentage marks and all sorts of signs and symbols. And another challenge was the public doesn't know who AMATS is, and they don't really care. So making this usable and part of our public involvement process and part of some marketing and part of some branding, this was the first step of that, and really kind of tying and making this into something that the public could digest. And then our shareability. We have a Pinterest button, I guess that's exciting. But I'm not putting this on my Pinterest pages, so I'm not sure who else would. So getting some functionality there where the newsletter, our social media efforts and things like that could really be shared, that's a challenge for us. So we basically kind of took a peek at what's going on nationwide, how are other NPOs sharing their information. I went to Transcom last fall in Arizona, and that was such a great education opportunity. And then lots of feedback from the feds, and what they wanted to see, and then the general public as well. So this is a work in progress. We've made a lot of changes, but I think it's easier to use. I think it's visually more pleasing, but we do have, we've got a box that we're working in. So, any questions?
Can you real quickly show the main documents and the what were we calling it? The governing documents. There we go.
Okay, so this used to be an alphabetical page, and you had to know the name of the document that you wanted. So now it's kind of broken down by work program, and a little bit more self-explanatory. If you don't know what the title of the bike plan was, you can find it. Another thing
but up on
was
there you go. Sorry.
The governing documents. So this is obviously our operating agreement, policies, procedures. This is our 2011 CERT. And then these are our primary work program documents. Rather than reposting them, because all of these have their own home in other places. So the look, the feel, governing documents now looks like this. You click on this, you get the map of our boundary. Here's your documents. Bylaws will be coming. Obviously, you guys don't have bylaws, so they'll link to policies and procedures. But this piece right here was something that I thought was really kind of key, is why do I care about these governing documents, and what else will teach me about these governing documents, and what else plays into these things. So who are the committees? You guys, if you haven't seen your page, are here with your contact. And
Yay, no pictures.
yeah, there's a
One hour.
I said, did we spell her name right?
I know. I double checked. Actually, I think I took it from your page. So, but yeah, it's been a process, and it's looking at the data before I started doing this was really telling. There's a lot of stuff that we had on that website that people hadn't accessed in years, even current, like more current efforts. So that was really interesting. And then kind of through community development, we were sharing each other's documents everywhere. And so you had a lot of duplication. And if somebody wasn't seeing it at AMATS, they could go in 3 other places. So do I really need it in AMATS? Maybe, maybe not. So I won't keep you any longer.
I know.
Questions, comments?
Nice work.
I know. It looks good.
Good spring cleaning effort.
I know that I can talk to you.
I had a sign that said web edits beware for my door. Like, there was really.
Yeah.
Good.
So, thank you. Are there any other informational items necessary?
Hopefully not, because I'm just letting you know. All right. So the next meeting, obviously, is the policy committee meeting, which is 2 weeks from today, downtown at 1:30, and we will be back here May 14th next month. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
I'll retrace.
Meeting is adjourned.